But what we didn't see was a pickup, for example, of Angolan media or sharing among various African media outlets for a distinctly African perspective. Why do you think it was that there wasn't a strong African interest in Kenya, in Nigeria, and other places where there was a little bit? To be fair, they did a couple interviews, but certainly it was not a top story by any measure. Why do you think that African coverage was more subdued?
I think it's because Joe Biden is over.
African countries on average welcome great power competition because it gives them a chance to choose who they want to deal with. And Angola is kind of the epitome of this. You find Russian, Chinese, Brazilian, everybody in Angola. However, I think the big challenge for the US will be, because the US sees China as an adversary and vice versa, they cannot, neither China nor the US can afford to do this thing without collaborating.
When we were in DC, like some of the kind of, officials that we were talking to were saying like, look, Africa is now the least important major geographical region for the US. Like both the South and North Poles, or Antarctica specifically, and Oceania are more important than Africa to the US. And I think that's just true. I mean, one sees that in the level of engagement. One even sees it implicitly in the kind of like the froth that comes from this one visit, because that's the one time that anyone has mentioned Africa in the last 6 months.
Now, I can hear already comments on YouTube and on X saying, well, why are you only focusing on the Western media and India? These are all of China's haters. These are all China's critics. So I actually went out and spent a lot of time today trying to find Chinese news coverage of Biden's visit, particularly from the likes of CGTN and other Chinese state media outlets, and yet did not find a single piece of coverage of it on CGTN. I did a Google search on it, nothing on Google and nothing on their website. I even looked in Chinese and almost no coverage of it. There was a little bit on Guancha, which is the Observer, where they basically quote Reuters and others saying, according to international media, Biden went to Angola. So there wasn't much at all.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden from beautiful Cape Town, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, it's the end of what's been a very busy week with a lot of big news in the China-Africa space. None more important, of course, than the visit of U.S. President Joe Biden to Angola. Now, this was a visit that he promised back in 22 after the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. He then didn't go in all of 23. Then in 24, he originally planned to go this fall, but then there were hurricanes in Florida, so he had to cancel it. In his mind, I bet you when he canceled it, he thought that his legacy would be continuing on in the White House in January, which it did not. So now he went to Angola and Cabo Verde, two countries. The Cabo Verde stop did not get a lot of coverage, but it's also notable as well. And he is the first American president to be back in Africa in more than 10 years. This was a big visit for the president. Didn't get a lot of news in Africa. We're going to talk about that today. The news that it got in the U.S. and around the world in the English language media was pretty narrow, not surprisingly, focused a lot about China, which is what we're going to talk about today. But let's just get started and dive into it. We're going to hear from the president. He laid out, and Cobus, I'm just going to play a whole bunch of sound bites for you, and I want to get your reaction. You're a media studies scholar, so this is your perfect show. We're going to talk a lot about how the media framed the story and what were the key issues. But let's first hear from Joe Biden speaking in Angola, laying out why the U.S. is, quote unquote, all in when it comes to Africa.
Being all in on Africa means making sure African voices are heard at the tables that matter most. Under my leadership of the United States, we brought in the African Union as a permanent member of the G20 economies. And we insisted on more African representation among the leaders of the International Monetary Fund and other world financial institutions. We've also pushed to ensure that developing nations do not have to choose between paying down unsustainable debt and being able to invest in their own people. And we're using our own voice to increase Africa's presence in the UN Security Council at the United Nations. That should happen. You can clap for that, folks. You should be in there. The United States continues to be the world's largest provider of humanitarian aid and development assistance. And that's going to increase. You know, that's the right thing for the wealthiest nation in the world to do. And today, I'm announcing over $1 billion in new humanitarian support for Africans displaced from homes by historic droughts and food insecurity. We know African leaders and citizens are seeking more than just aid. You seek investment. So the United States is expanding our relationship all across Africa, from assistance to aid, to investment to trade, moving from patrons to partners.
Okay, Cobus, a lot to unpack there. We're going to take piece by piece and kind of get your take on this. Let's just put a little bit of context there on that investment. U.S. direct investment in Africa peaked back in 2014 with a total FDI stock of $69 billion. 7 years later, it has been on a steady decline down to $45 billion. It peaked, it kind of bounced up a little bit in 24 again, so we're seeing a little bit of a rebound. And just to give you some perspective on this, last year, China's FDI stock in African countries was just over $42 billion. Now, this word investment is going to be a very important word in our discussion today because you're going to hear pretty much every journalist misuse that word in the context of the Chinese. And so they use the word investment and lending and creditor all interchangeably. And there is a clear lack of literacy among international journalists in terms of understanding what the difference is between the financial engagement that China's done in Africa, which part of it has been investment, but most of it has been in the form of credits and loans and lending and all sorts of different other financial tools, not investment. Okay, let's start. That was a lot, $1 billion of new money coming into Africa. That's good news, right, Cobus?
Yeah, it is. Particularly also the fact that that isn't just spread across general assistance, but it seems to be particularly climate targeted. I think it is great news. You know, we obviously just off an extremely contentious COP meeting in Azerbaijan a week or two ago, where the main fight was between global north and global south countries about exactly this issue, you know, the economic and other impact of climate disasters on the global south. So that kind of targeted money, I think, is encouraging.
Okay, so in his remarks, you heard him talk about unsustainable debts. Now, he's not talking about the debts from Poland or Azerbaijan or France. That is a wink, wink, nod, nod to the Chinese. One of the talking points that the U.S. administration was saying on background was they were much more explicit, suggesting that and we're going to have some sound on this later on, but they were basically laying the debt crisis at China's feet in Africa. And so this is going to be a very important theme of the news coverage and the way that the trip was framed in the international media, which again has a big influence on how the narratives are also shaped in Africa. And so one of the reasons why you're not going to hear many African perspectives today on the show in terms of African media outlets is because there was very little coverage of it. And what they did use often came from Reuters or Associated Press or wire services that included a lot of these references from the West and from the US and European media, and in fact, even some of the Indian media. So the diss against the Chinese for unsustainable debts, did that capture your attention?
Yes, some of the coverage by Western journalists, who I assume were in the pool of reporters traveling with the president, was also quoting unnamed officials saying that interest rates on Chinese or on other lenders, quote unquote, debt is so high that, you know, kind of plunges Africa into debt distress, essentially. So I was writing about that for our newsletter today, and I was just doing basic kind of research using kind of resources like the Boston University Global Development Policy Center's China-Africa loan database. And overall, what I could find is, I was looking at Angola specifically, that obviously the Chinese loans to Angola is very, very complicated. There's very many of them. But China Development Bank is Angola's largest creditor, Chinese creditor, and their aid data was citing World Bank statistics that those loans are around 4.3% in interest. And then I was just looking at the kinds of interest and yield that Angolan Eurobonds were getting on the bourse in Frankfurt, which was the ones that I found was north of 9%. So just in terms of that alone, like the interest rates is just not true. And so I was a little appalled, I have to say, at this.
Yeah, and one other key point on that is the repayment terms on the Eurobond debt, the private creditor debt, tends to be much shorter. So 5-10 years oftentimes, whereas some of the concessional lending from the Chinese is oftentimes as much as 30 years, and then they restructure to extend those. So the repayment terms also are very important on that. Very important baseline.
We should also say that Angola, even though like debt restructuring, like restructuring Chinese loans is rare, not many countries manage to pull it off, but Angola did pull it off. Actually, Angola did manage to reschedule some of its major loans to China quite recently. So also, kind of like calling China out for being uniquely inflexible is also not true in this case, especially compared to commercial lenders in the West, which frequently kind of gives very little concession.
Now, very important baseline fact here. Again, we're going to talk about investment, but another baseline fact here, and this was communicated by the White House, again, in their background briefings, a lot of times through insinuation rather than direct accusation, but insinuating that Zambia, Ghana, Ethiopia all encountered debt distress because of Chinese loans. That is not true. The facts do not support that. Zambia defaulted on its debt on a $32.5 million Eurobond coupon payment. Ghana fell behind in its Eurobond debt, as did Ethiopia as well. And by the way, we know that in Sri Lanka, that was the case as well. It was the private creditor debt that was bearing down on them that forced them to default. We do not say this to defend the Chinese and Chinese lending and not doing whataboutism here. It is just a fact as it is right now that the debt from the Chinese did not provoke the defaults in those three African countries. So the insinuation by the White House that that is the case is highly misleading and needs to be contextualized in that respect. Now, a lot of the attention was focused on the Lobito corridor. We have spoken at length on this show about this railway, the Benguela Railway, which basically goes from the copper cobalt belts in the DRC and Zambia to bring minerals and metals and all sorts of resources to the port of Lobito on the Atlantic coast. So this was something that the U.S. has put billions of dollars in as part of the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment. Again, we probably won't spend too much time on the details of this. We've got tons of information on the Lobito Atlantic Railway and the Lobito Corridor on our site and in previous shows. But I want to talk a lot about today the framing of the Lobito Corridor, because that is what the media focused on. And that was something that caught the attention of our own Geronima, who I wanted to have on the show today. He's our Africa editor, for those of you not familiar with Gero. And by the way, Cobus, he let it rip on NPR, National Public Radio. And he was interviewed by NPR on this and as part of his Carnegie Endowment for International Peace Fellowship. And he basically said, hey, guys, this isn't a big deal. The trip, it was not anywhere near a big of a deal as it was made out to be. He's right now attending an academic conference in Belgium. So he was not able to join us for the conversation on the show today. But I asked him to share his feedback and his thoughts on the trip in a WhatsApp memo. So you're going to hear that the audio is a little bit punchy at times, where he's a little bit close to the microphone. Bear with me, because his comments are absolutely insightful and really present a contrarian view to what you heard in most of the U.S. and European media coverage. Let's take a listen now to Geronima joining us from Brussels.
I believe that Joe Biden trips in Angola was significant in a diplomatic perspective, in a way that it showed that he maintained his promises to travel in Africa, even though it's late, very late, and the end of his term. But at least he made that happen. And I believe that from a symbolic perspective, it's really shows that he was determined enough to fulfill his promise to say, I'm going to come to visit Africa. And even though he just visited 2 countries technically, but 1 country mainly, but I believe that that's the significant part of his trip to Angola. But beyond that, I don't really believe there is much of substance behind that trip in Angola. I know that the Lobito corridor is a very interesting and a very important project, but I do believe that there's a lot of political PR communication around it that's kind of somehow covered that the fact that there's not really much substance into it, in a sense that the way they presented it as US tools to counter China in Africa, I think it's an overstatement of the reality on the ground, the reality to the fact that to begin with, that project from Trafigura was not a US led project. It was first Trafigura winning a concession contract and the US joining after that. And I think that adding up other aspects of the agricultural solar project is really trying to give a substance to it. But fundamentally, it was not really a US project to begin with. And second, to present it as a strategic move to counter China in critical minerals in Africa, I think it's also an overstatement because, as I said before, it's just a railway. As long as there's no US company mining in the DRC or in Angola or in Zambia anyway, or as long as there's no those minerals going to the US or to Europe or any kind of way, the Western Hemisphere, I don't believe that there is really much of a substance to say that it's countering China in Africa. And let's not forget that most of those minerals will be coming from Chinese mining in Zambia or in the DRC. And from a business perspective, Trafigura has every interest to let Chinese company using the railway to make it profitable so it can generate revenue to allow them to reimburse the loan they got from the US, because at the end, it's also a loan they're going to have to reimburse. So personally, it's as much as it's important from a diplomatic perspective, I don't think it has the geopolitical weight and importance that a lot of the media has given to it.
Let me just expand on a few things that Giraud said. So first of all, those of you not familiar with Trafigura, it is one of the world's largest global commodity trading firms. They move a lot in the logistics space. And so they basically, after the stuff comes out of the ground, Trafigura is one of the companies that actually gets it to market. They were the lead on the Lobito corridor. One of the reasons why Giraud is pushing back against this narrative that you're going to hear extensively today, that the Lobito corridor is meant to challenge the Chinese, is because it's a little bit of an absurd statement. And here's why. The refurbishment program is being done by a Portuguese company called Moto Engel. Moto Engel is 30 to 40% owned by China's largest construction company, okay? So the Chinese are involved there. There is nothing, as Giraud pointed out, that will stop the Chinese from using the Lobito corridor to transit their minerals to the port of Lobito, should they want to do that. So that's not really a countering thing. Giraud's point that so long as the Americans aren't mining themselves in the DRC and in Zambia, they have to rely on the Chinese to get the stuff out because that's what's going to pay for and repay the loans. And finally, the locomotives that they're going to use are from China. And you're going to hear that they have GE engines in them, but China's benefiting from selling the locomotives and the rail cars that are going to go on the Lobito corridor that was all meant to confront and challenge the Chinese. There's a little bit of absurdity here in the discourse, Cobus, because when you actually lift up the hood on this thing and see how the Chinese thumbprint is all over this, from Moto Engel to the minerals themselves being transported and to the fact that Chinese contractors are going to be supplying the engines or the locomotives, I don't know where you go with that. I mean, it's certainly not confronting the Chinese. And I'm going to be very curious to see if the incoming Trump administration picks up on this.
Yeah, I mean, there's the real question. Because in the first place, with all of the coverage that we've seen of the Lobito corridor over the last few months, it still remains quite challenging to say, when you read all of that coverage, to say how much of this has actually already been built and how much of it is still lies in the future somewhere, right? Obviously the refurbishment of the line itself was an earlier project. So a large part of the line within Angola is running, but some of the connections still have to be built, and a lot of the kind of ancillary agri-tech and, mobile connectivity links and so on that the Lobito Corridor planning authorities within the US government, have really been promoting are also still in the future. So it's very difficult to really say, how much of the Lobito Corridor actually exists outside of discourse. And then, we've already seen incoming Trump officials being very dismissive of different State Department, initiatives in Africa and other parts of the world. And for example, sanitation initiatives in Africa being particularly kind of, singled out by some of the incoming people that are supposed to, quote unquote, kind of streamline kind of US international presence. So how much of this is going to survive post January 20th? It's difficult to say.
Well, one of the other things that we've heard from a lot of stakeholders in Washington who are involved in the Lobito corridor is that they themselves don't want this to be about confronting China. They want this to be about creating a very dynamic project that generates business and that generates sustainability and that generates logistics. But they know that if they go to Congress and say this is about helping Angola, Zambia, the DRC, and ultimately U.S. foreign policy in those countries, it's going to be a much more difficult sell than if it is to say, well, we're going to do this to whack China and to confront China. The politics in Washington to release the money make China a central focus. Now, all of this narrative about China is, again, filtered right through into the coverage, in part because, again, these off-record briefings, these unnamed sources from the White House were feeding a lot of this narrative. And you're going to hear some consistency in the discussion. I'm going to play a number of different clips now from various media around the world and how they covered it. And Cobus, again, as a media scholar, I'm really, really keen to get your take on it. Let's start with the BBC. And they spoke with their senior Africa correspondent, Anne Soy, and the question of whether or not this Biden visit will help the U.S. catch up to China's engagement in Africa over the past 25 years.
And the live pictures that you can see there on the screen are from the presidential palace, where Joe Biden should be arriving shortly to meet with the country's president, Joao Lourenço. Well, I've been speaking to our senior Africa correspondent, Anne Soy, and asked if the U.S. can do enough to challenge China's growing influence on the continent.
They are doing something, and it is a major reset of the kind of engagements that they have had with the continent. From years past, it has been a lot to do with aid in health, in education, sort of the softer areas where you cannot really see physically the results. However, this is really taking on China on something that they have been doing over the last 20 years through their Belt and Road Initiative. Whether they are going to be replaced, not likely. And that is because even in this Lobito corridor, this railway that you mentioned, Catherine, the Chinese were the first to rehabilitate it after the end of the war in 2002. They invested in it, they rehabilitated it. So we are entering a new phase of, relations with African countries where it is multipolar. It is not just one dominant force, but the US is certainly challenging China's growing influence.
Is it though? I mean, really? We're talking about one refurbished railway versus something around 8,000 to 10,000 kilometers of greenfield railway that the Chinese have actually built in Africa. And I mean, what's awful about this is that this crappy coverage makes people like you and I sound like we're some kind of Chinese propagandist, which could be hard, further from the truth. But it's just ridiculous to compare one project with what's been happening over the past 25 years and the lack of engagement by the Americans over the past 25 years. And so I think this is a narrative that the Wall Street Journal really went hard on. Like, America's back. Here we're going to challenge China, confronting China. I think that framing is highly, highly flawed.
I agree. I fully agree. And I think it reflects for me something that I've been thinking of in a broader context over the last year, which is, in the first place, how dependent, the Anglophone world is on the media of just a few large media outlets to essentially bring the entire world to them. And how for a long time that function of AP, Reuters, the New York Times, the Washington Post has been basically unquestioned. I mean, except for outside of media study circles. And I think what we've really seen over the last year, I think it was particularly, maybe with some of the most egregious examples I think came out during different aspects of the Gaza crisis. But Africa, I think, shows it even more, is if you look at Africa in Western news coverage, it very frequently kind of functions as a kind of a non-space, a non-place. Right. And in the process, it becomes this kind of like place from where all surprising things emanate and where, where it's really impossible to really check on whether anything is true or not. And that, I get very strong vibes of that in this coverage. That Africa, it's the fact that something is happening in Africa puts this kind of exoticized gloss on it, that in the first place makes it okay for everything, for those countries to be fully flattened into geopolitical arenas rather than actual places with actual people. But then also it becomes this kind of like Never Land kind of thing where you can talk about this project, for example, as countering China without having to engage with what China actually does in Africa or whether this project actually exists or not. So in that sense, it's very revealing for me of the smallness of Western media, which is a surprising thing considering that we always thought of the Western media as so big. So there's the limitations of Western coverage, I think, was really glaring in this case.
I'm just surprised that a senior Africa correspondent, and Anne Soy's been covering the continent now for a long time. I've been following her for many years, that the journalists who are there for the international media outlets like the BBC aren't more sophisticated about what the Chinese have been doing. There are resources like ours, like Boston University, like Johns Hopkins, like Chatham House. I mean, we can go down the line. Even, SAIA, your former employer in South Africa, ISS in Pretoria, numbers of think tanks. And yet these guys are still bringing out the same old tropes and not going beyond the very superficial talking points. That's the part that's so disappointing. And you see this in a lot of the coverage from the various media. Well, let's continue on our journey around the world of media, and we're going to go up to Paris to my former employer, France 24, France 24. I used to be the editor-in-chief there many, many moons ago, back more than a decade ago. And I used to do some of the on-air commentating like we're going to hear, so it's fun for me to kind of walk down memory lane a little bit and see what they were doing. But they talked about whether or not this Trump question, which was hanging over the trip, whether or not the Lobito corridor will survive the incoming Trump administration and what they're going to do about it. Kedavani Gorjestani is an international affairs editor at France 24, and she shared a few thoughts on that part of the story, which, Cobus, I'm very, very keen to get your thoughts on.
Donald Trump is someone who likes doing deals. And if a deal is good for America, he will be doing it. So, for example, the Lobito corridor, that could be seen as something that is beneficial to the United States and possibly something that Donald Trump will continue. That's at least the feeling within the Biden administration. An official a few days ago saying that they don't believe that some of these initiatives will be rolled back by Donald Trump because they believe that he sees possibly a benefit for the United States. And one main thing is very important when you think about how Donald Trump is going to be looking at the African continent is the competition with China. We know how much Donald Trump is focused on competing with China. We know how much China has invested in Africa, and it is likely that Donald Trump will see Africa as a playing field for that competition with China on the broader stage, and therefore that might be something that pushes him to continue along those lines of investing in Africa, not necessarily to help out the African continent, but to compete with China.
There you go. There's the sandbox of great power competition that you were just talking about, flattening the continent.
Yeah, that is, again, unfortunately, one does tend to see that on all sides of the debate. It isn't, it isn't just, we're in a very kind of starkly geopolitical moment. So it becomes, I think, even more stark, in the way that it is being discussed. But I think the main difference, between the Democrats and Republicans were that the Democrats would put a disclaimer in front of that discourse saying it's really important not to talk about these countries as geopolitical kind of arenas. And then they would excise the word China from all of of the subsequent text and, kind of just refer to the lenders, for example. But that doesn't change the flattening, right? Kind of the Africa remains as flattened as ever. It just becomes a kind of a textual optics difference, and I think that is very true, I think, of European commentary on Africa as well, which is particularly, I think something to point out, I think, in relation to Europe, because they have such a much closer relationship with Africa than the US does. Like they're right next to each other. And yet Africa very, very far away from Europe somehow, magically.
But this flattening that you're talking about is not uniquely a European and American phenomenon. I spent most of the day today looking through clips on it, and African media themselves do the same thing. There's a constant talk about Africa and being, in the middle of a great power competition. I mean, Africans are flattening Africa as much as anybody else is.
It's true. And it is important, I think, for anyone who writes about Africa to really grapple with that issue, because, of course, the default line that we always have, right, kind of is that Africa isn't a country. It's really important to not talk about Africa in this flattened way, which, of course, it's really, really important not to talk in Africa in this flattened way. However, at the same time, Africa as a continent, with notable exceptions, shares some kind of core experiences. And one of the core experiences, I think, is this tendency to be flattened by the rest of the world. So in that sense, there's a kind of a chicken and egg situation there, because if you're an African journalist or an African commentator writing about the continent in the international context, it is on the one hand really important to correct this flattening, but on the other hand, you should also be realistic about the positioning of Africa in the global discourse, which leads you to reflattening the continent, even as you're protesting against the flattening. So it's a really, really kind of complicated cycle that is difficult to break.
Well, if you want to hear an example of what this actually sounds like, let's take a listen to a Bloomberg TV quick take. So quick take are these little clips that Bloomberg publishes on their social media channels and on YouTube. And Bloomberg TV correspondent Jennifer Zabasaja, she traveled with the president. I don't get the sense that she is a journalist based in Bloomberg's Africa bureaus. I may be wrong, but I'm not sure. But just from the tone of what she was saying, it gave me a hint that she came from the U.S. But let's take a listen to her take on China, Angola, Africa, and Biden, along with the great power competition.
President Joe Biden's visit to Angola was the first by a sitting U.S. president in nearly a decade. And Angola is hoping it translates to even more non-oil investment. And for the U.S., it could be an opportunity to counter Chinese influence in the region. Oil has accounted for some 90% of the country's export revenue, selling more than half its output to China. But it's faced calls to diversify and is eyeing infrastructure. It's relied heavily on China for infrastructure investment in the past, but is looking to privatize everything from its state-owned airline TAG to the flagship Lobito railway project. Now, the U.S. has committed some $5 billion to revitalize the corridor, which connects the copper mines of Zambia to Angola's port city. Congo and Zambia hold an estimated 10% of the world's copper deposits and the majority of the planet's cobalt, minerals that are crucial to the EV transition and cleaner energy. Now, experts say it's unlikely we'll see a divestment, even with the new U.S. administration, as countering China has bipartisan backing in the U.S. But it's likely access to these reserves will continue to be a battleground for investment and influence.
Okay, there it is, the battleground. And interesting, the acknowledgement that countering China, of course, is the bilateral issue. So that's to your point, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, they change their style a little bit, but the substance remains the same. And I think that clip really spoke to a lot of that.
What I always want more acknowledgement of in this coverage, admittedly that's a tall order, but what I always find so fascinating is the way that these kind of commentary is both quote unquote objective and partisan at the same time, kind of in the sense of like that it's couched in the terms of providing a view of the world, kind of for you, discerning news consumer, and yet providing a team us framing, right? Kind of like where kind of opposition to China is naturalized, just makes sense. It's just common sense, right? And that both of those things are happening at the same time. That's such a kind of like specifically Western media trick. Not trick is the wrong word. Like it, kind of like, because it's not a trick. It's a worldview, right? And a revealing one, I think. And it is very difficult to kind of deflatten the conversation around Africa in that context, because it's all about global centers of power, and everything else kind of becomes subject to that larger overarching logic. It's kind of fascinating to hear it in action.
So the theme of great power competition was certainly a major constant throughout much of the US and European coverage, but not all of it. And I want to play an excerpt from the popular news show, the PBS NewsHour on public television in the United States. Host Amna Nawaz was talking with Mvemba Fezo Dizolele, who is the director of the Africa program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. That's a very big think tank there. And Mvemba was really talking about how the U.S. and China are actually going to need to cooperate with one another in order to make the Lobito corridor a success. Again, that's a slightly contrarian view based on what we've heard and what we've heard in the past. And so take a listen now to why Mvemba says there's actually some hope for collaboration between the two major powers.
We know, of course, that this is critical when it comes to U.S. need for the minerals that we're talking about exporting from African nations to fuel the technology future the U.S. is trying to build. But we also know these nations are much more than just exporters of these minerals. You're talking about a continent that's home to 1.5 billion people. So to have superpowers competing to some degree for resources, for partnership and alliance, what does that mean for a country like Angola or Zambia or Kenya?
So for Angola, it's about options and choices. African countries on average welcome great power competition because it gives them a chance to choose who they want to deal with. And Angola is kind of the epitome of this. You find Russian, Chinese, Brazilian, everybody in Angola. However, I think the big challenge for the US will be, because the US sees China as an adversary and vice versa, they cannot, neither China nor the US can afford to do this thing without collaborating. China controls the mines. Mm-hmm. So if the US is going to evacuate these products out of Congo and Zambia to this railroad, the Lobito corridor, but if the Chinese control the mines, so the Chinese still have a leverage. They can block the mines and push it towards the Indian Ocean, which is the traditional way they've been taking the resources as well. So you cannot avoid this collaboration. In fact, when I was in Angola, just a quick story, I was talking to the board of the Benguela Railroad, and they told me, recently we ordered 100 locomotives from China. I say, why just China, not America? They say, well, but we asked the Chinese to put GE engines in those locomotives. So that's already a prime example of collaboration. The GE engines couldn't get there without approval from the State Department or Department of Commerce.
I see what he's saying. I'm not that optimistic about broader coalitions and broader cooperations between Chinese and U.S. stakeholders beyond the corporate sector. So we see a lot of cooperation, as Mvemba pointed out, in the corporate sector. GE is a great example. GE does a lot of infrastructure work in the Middle East and in Africa that is actually executed by Chinese state-owned contractors. So that is actually something quite well known, and they've been doing that for some time. Mvemba did fall into a trap, though. Again, just another fact check here. He talks about China controlling the mines. And we have to remember, and again, this is another big problem with the overstatement of China's presence in Africa. In all, when you look at all of Chinese mining in Africa, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace just a couple of months ago issued some new data and a new chart on this. The total amount of output that is controlled by Chinese entities is just 6.7% of the total. So to suggest that China controls the mines, even in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where up until this year, Glencore was the largest exporter of cobalt. So to suggest that the Chinese are somehow controlling the output of these mines and the minerals and the metals that come from the DRC and from Zambia is a vast oversimplification. Now, they are a major player, to be sure, there's no doubt, but Glencore is also a major, and Anglo-American and the European mining companies and Australian mining companies across Africa are actually significantly larger, orders of magnitude larger. Just Anglo-American alone is almost 3 times the size of what the total Chinese output of all the Chinese companies. And so Mvemba's framing that the Chinese control the mines, I think, is problematic there. But nonetheless, that sense of cooperation, collaboration, do you agree with Mvemba and the way he set that up?
I think he makes a really important point. So I think, just on the mine issue, I think he was maybe, or the way I understood it was that he was kind of speaking in somewhat shorthanded and particularly referring to the post Glencore deal, that put more of the cobalt in CMOC's hands, right? Like they were specifically talking about the cobalt mines rather than mining generally.
But Glencore still is the second largest. The CMOC just surpassed because they did a surge of output this past 18 months or so. But Glencore is still a major player in the DRC, to be sure.
Yes.
I guess I'm just trying to get away from this idea that the Chinese control it. They have a overwhelming share. They're a majority, there's no doubt, but they don't have control. And also, it strips the agency of the Congolese, who also have some power. Because remember, it was the Congolese that shut down TFM for much of last year. They blocked it. So that was an assertion of Congolese agency. Now, Mavemba, super smart guy, been around a long time. He's Congolese himself. He knows this. There might have been shorthand here, no doubt, but this is actually a common theme that we hear about an overstatement of China's control or dominance or presence in the African mining sector.
Yes, and we should say TFM is a shorthand name for the Tengefungurume mine. That's the largest cobalt mine in the world. I fully agree with you on those points. I think he kind of implicitly makes a fantastic point, which is that which I think connects actually kind of also bolsters your point, which is that this kind of great power competition in many ways is actually great news for African countries, even though we've been decrying it, up and down, is in the sense that it defamiliarizes Africa or disrupts some of the business as usual in the way that the continent is positioned more trans-historically, because at least it adds pressure and raises the need for greater engagement and possibly investment in the continent. Because as you were saying, this kind of way that the Chinese presence in the mining sector in Africa is kind of monsterized or exoticized in the discourse has the additional role of normalizing and covering over the ongoing structural dominance of all African resources by Western power, right? So we are supposed to be scared and surprised by the Chinese owning 6% of mining output, not mostly Western companies owning or controlling around 90% of mining output in Africa and having controlled that over decades and decades. That's supposed to be normal. The Chinese are supposed to be the crazy aberration, right? So it is very interesting that this kind of geopoliticization of Africa's position in the world in relation to minerals, even though it so fully flattens African agency, also in its own way heightens African agency because Africa is coming from such a radical lack of agency because of its structural positioning in the global economy. One that has been so normalized that it's become basically invisible, right? So in that sense, I think, I can't really say more than that. I think he kind of makes that point, I think, very clearly.
I'm looking at the Carnegie graphic here, and we've put this on our site. I'll put it in the show notes just for some context here. So Chinese companies, all Chinese companies account for 6.7% of total mining output from Africa. Anglo-American, 14.9% of the continent's total mining output. Glencore alone, just one company, comes in at 4.2%. So Glencore alone is 2/3 the size of the entire Chinese mining output, all of it. Guinea, Zambia, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, South Africa, all of that. That context is oftentimes missing, and I think that's the problem that I had with Mavemba's framing of it, that the Chinese control, because, yes, certainly in the DRC, very strong player, no doubt he's correct there, but the word control and dominate, that framing, I think, is highly problematic. And so something just to think about on that front. Now, we're going to kind of shift our attention now away from the Western media and focus on some other parts of the world. Interestingly, Cobus, there was very little coverage of this, as I mentioned, in the African media. Most of the news coverage on African websites, with the exception of the Daily Maverick in South Africa, was Reuters, AP, AFP, just the wire services. They did not send reporters. Obviously, it's very expensive to send reporters. Getting credentialed is very expensive. So that's not entirely surprising. But what we didn't see was a pickup, for example, of Angolan media or sharing among various African media outlets for a distinctly African perspective. Why do you think it was that there wasn't a strong African interest in Kenya, in Nigeria, and other places, where there was a little bit? To be fair, they did a couple interviews, but certainly it was not a top story by any measure. In fact, SABC, one of the largest broadcasters on the continent, did just, I think, 2 very simple stories on it with a freelancer, clearly not putting a lot of emphasis on it. Why do you think that African coverage was more subdued?
I think it's because Joe Biden is over.
So you're saying if Trump came today, he will never come, but let's say he did, they would be all over the story.
Oh, I think so. They'd be putting a lot more resources to try and get reporters there and navigating the difficulties of traveling to Angola, which is significant sometimes. I think everyone assumes that whatever Biden has announced probably won't come through because Trump is in a, that when a new kind of lion takes over a herd, it kills all the babies of the previous lions. It's a kind of a similar kind of situation. The cubs are dead. Well, a whole bunch of them will be anyway. I think that's just the default assumption, I think, among Africa. It's like, well, sure, let's see what gets announced, but it's not worth kind of putting resources into cover.
Well, so much of the coverage up until now, what we've discussed, has been semi-serious. I mean, it hasn't been entertaining. I'm going to liven the mood now here, Cobus, a little bit, and we're going to head over to New Delhi because Indian media coverage of the Chinese in Africa is... it's hard to keep a straight face. Let's talk Vantage, which is hosted by, Vantage is a hugely popular show. And the host, Palki Sharma, who's the managing editor of First Post, which is one of the big major media outlets in India, she gets an enormous amount of attention online. Her clips go viral all the time. They're very famous on Vantage, and Palki in particular, for really confronting the West and confronting China with this very direct style of reporting. She tells it like it is. It's almost like a Tucker Carlson kind of thing where she looks into the camera with all the sincerity in the world and says, I'm not BSing you. I'm telling you like it is. Let's listen to Palki Sharma.
Lobito is a port in Angola on the Atlantic coast. It could become a gateway for exports to the Americas. That's the plan anyway. And what do they plan to export from here? Mineral wealth from Central Africa. Beyond Angola, you have Zambia and the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Both nations have resources like copper and cobalt. Copper has multiple uses. Cobalt is essential for electric vehicle batteries. The US wants both these minerals and anything else that they can get from Central Africa. Currently, it's difficult to transport these minerals. It takes days to bring them from Central Africa to a port. But that's where the Lobito corridor comes in. The US-financed railways will speed up the transport of minerals and make exporting them more efficient. The corridor will give the US a direct pipeline to Africa's mineral wealth. Biden has been championing this project for years. His administration has pumped in $4 billion already, and he's not done yet. He now wants to accelerate the next phase of the corridor. It's a railway line connecting Zambia to Lobito. Biden wants to facilitate this next phase, so he co-hosted a summit today with Angola's President Lourenço. They invited the leaders of Zambia, the DRC, and Tanzania. They're really making a hard sell here. But why does Joe Biden want this corridor so bad? To counter Chinese influence in Africa. Beijing has been investing in such projects for years. It has invested in African mining operations. It has spent billions in Tanzanian ports and railways. All of this is part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. The US is lagging far behind. But it still wants to try and compete because it has an ace up its sleeve. Yesterday, Biden said, and I'm quoting, "We've also pushed to ensure that developing nations do not have to choose between paying down unsustainable debt and being able to invest in their own people." Unsustainable debt. He's talking about China and Beijing's debt trap diplomacy. Everything China has done in Africa comes at a price. The debt has led to ballooning payments and sometimes outright defaults. Zambia defaulted on its debt in 2020, and now Joe Biden is quoting the very same country. Clearly, the US is trying to wean African nations away from China. But will the Lobito corridor be enough to convince them? Or is it too little too late? We'll find out in the months ahead.
There's that sincerity there. So again, let's do a little bit of fact checking here. Zambia did not default on its debt because of Chinese loans. It defaulted on its debt because it could not repay Eurobond debt. So that was just that there. Again, the debt trap issue is something that I always want to remind the Chinese, who just whine and whine and whine about the West, attacking on the debt trap. You don't actually hear it as much in the West. You still hear it from Biden himself, to be sure. But it comes out of people like Palki Sharma way more, all the time. They go off on this. And let's not forget that the debt trap narrative has been constructed today came from Brahma Chelani, an Indian pundit. I don't want to give Brahma Chelani the credit of being a scholar or an analyst, because I think he's basically like a Gordon Chang kind of guy who's just he thrives in social media by saying extreme things that get a lot of people worked up. But if anybody takes Brahma Chelani seriously, they're not intellectually serious themselves. So I'll leave it at that. Anyway, that's the Indian take, or at least Palki Sharma's take on this from Vantage. What do you think?
The debt trap narrative as this kind of co-created project between India and Western countries is just fascinating for me. But yeah, I mean, this is the narrative, right? Kind of like this, like we, and I mean, we've been fact checking this narrative for literal years, and we still see it just moving on, just continuing, rolling along. Again, it's kind of fascinating to hear. I think it is kind of revealing also of India's kind of, just the kind of complexities of India, I think, in how it is in the world and how it, how it kind of like positions itself in opposition to many different actors, at once. And it's just, it's just amazing to hear. It's like kind of like a masterclass in narrative.
There's another flaw in her framing and what we've heard previously, even in the Bloomberg TV report, suggesting that the reason why the Trump administration is going to keep the Lobito corridor is because it wants to be able to access critical minerals for the energy transition and for electric vehicles, when in fact, Trump himself is on record and the MAGA movement is all over this. They hate EVs and they don't like the energy transition. So they want critical minerals for military and security purposes and some corporate to put it into an iPhone, for example, but not necessarily to put, 400 pounds of battery metals in an electric vehicle. Certainly Elon Musk wants that, but at this point, Elon Musk's view, we don't see prevailing in the administration, at least on EVs. That may change, of course, but there is not a lot of consensus within the MAGA movement on electric vehicles. Well, actually, that's not true. There is a lot of consensus on EVs. They hate them. Drill, baby, drill is the mantra. So it makes me wonder how much they're going to be so passionate about these critical minerals, given the fact that the major consumption of those is EVs, which they don't really want to support. They're going to take away the tax credits. They're going to gut part of the Inflation Reduction Act, which has a lot of the benefits for that. They're going to keep some of it, but they're not going to be as passionate about extracting critical minerals in the volumes that you would need to supply Ford, GM, Tesla with large quantities of battery metals. I think that's still to be determined.
Yeah, I think what comes with that, which also still needs to be determined, is how the Trump administration's traditional kind of openness to business, to just having a direct line to kind of like high-level kind of corporate interests, how that's going to be balanced with this much more kind of ideological line about countering China. Because both of those things are at play at once, right? And so it's going to be very interesting to see how, for example, pressure from US corporates to keep getting cheap access to refined cobalt from China, which I think a lot of them would still prefer, simply because it's easier, to how they balance that pressure with the larger pressure to have to be seen to be containing China in the world. My hunch, and again, this is just a hunch, is that it may well be that if they do continue with Lobito related stuff, that the casualty may be all of the other kind of stuff that the Biden administration was building around the Lobito corridor. All of the agri-tech and mobile phone connections and all of those things may be sacrificed in the name of just kind of business efficiency and cutting down on US government spread. And that that what we may see is just a kind of a bare bones kind of like investment or engagement in just kind of getting the minerals out. But again, kind of like it depends so much on who gets Trump's ear, right? Whether between ideologues and business interests, who speaks louder in the second Trump administration. And that, I think, is really still up for grabs.
Yeah, that's definitely an open question. Now, I can hear already comments on YouTube and on X saying, well, why are you only focusing on the Western media and India? These are all of China's haters. These are all China's critics. So I actually went out and spent a lot of time today trying to find Chinese news coverage of Biden's visit, particularly from the likes of CGTN and other Chinese state media outlets. I assume that CGTN has a big presence in Africa. They love to tout the fact that they have this big headquarters in Nairobi and they cover the continent as competently as Al Jazeera, BBC, CNN, and others. And yet did not find a single piece of coverage of it on CGTN. I did a Google search on it, nothing on Google and nothing on their website. I even looked in Chinese and almost no coverage of it. There was a little bit on Guancha, which is the Observer, where they basically quote Reuters and others saying, according to international media, Biden went to Angola. So there wasn't much at all. But I did manage to find our old friend, Hu Wenping. And I say old friend because I don't think she talks to us anymore. But many years ago, remember, we had Professor He on our show several times. That's right, back in the day. And she is among the most notable and prominent China-Africa scholars in China. A long time ago, she was at the Chinese Academy for Social Sciences, which is by far the most prestigious think tank in China. Today, she's an honorary research fellow at Zhejiang Yuexiu University and a research fellow at the China Africa Institute. So she's still very much in the space. She wrote an opinion column for Global Times, and Global Times is the Communist Party's major newspaper in both English and in Chinese. So in order to kind of enliven this rather than me reading it, I plugged it into a text-to-audio AI generator. And so let's listen to a few of the points made by Professor He Wenping.
The Biden administration's policy toward Africa in recent years has been to publicly acknowledge the continent's important status and role on the international stage in a high-profile manner, but it has not spent any real money to contribute to Africa's development. The limited investment in African countries often depends on specific circumstances, with a focus on selecting pillar countries for investment and support. Biden's 4-year administration and a single visit to one African country make it difficult to achieve the purpose of improving U.S.-Africa relations and leaving a strong African imprint on his diplomatic legacy. The idea of countering China and Russia through a single visit is simply not possible.
So say what you want about He Wenping. She does kind of, doesn't hold punches. Cobus, one visit isn't going to make up the difference, especially a visit as a lame duck president, 6 weeks before he's going to leave office. We can't overlook the fact that it was a difficult visit for Biden as well. He struggled to stay awake during some of the speeches. Fox News, by the way, loved that. They went live to when the president was nodding off. Didn't care about anything that was happening on the, what they were saying. But it was like, there's the president nodding off. Grandpa's falling asleep. So Professor He, not holding any punches, not afraid at all of one visit. A very contrarian view to what we've heard from Western media saying this is confronting China, this is challenging China. Here she's saying, whatever.
Yeah, the thing is, obviously we cover a lot of the minutiae of different kinds of Chinese engagements on the continent on a day-by-day basis. And one does see there's a lot of things going on. Compared to its relationship with, say, Southeast Asia, obviously the China-Africa relationship is small. But at the same time, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of announcements week by week of different kinds of things. Everything from cultural diplomacy to new factories to acquisitions, mergers and acquisitions, and so on and so on. And there just isn't that much action on the US side. I think in those kind of broad terms, I think she kind of has a point. When we were in DC, like some of the kind of people, officials that we were talking to were saying like, look, Africa is now the least important major geographical region for the US. Like both the South and North Poles, or Antarctica specifically, and Oceania are more important. than Africa to the US. And I think that's just true. I mean, one sees that in the level of engagement. One even sees it implicitly in the kind of like the froth that comes from this one visit, because that's the one time that anyone has mentioned Africa in the last 6 months, in this discussion. So,
but I think you could make the same case with the Chinese. Find me a region that is less important than Africa for the Chinese.
Yeah, I mean, Africa is a minor player for the Chinese too, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese are much more invested in South America. We saw that with the Chancay port and the trip to Brazil. The Middle East is now the major supplier of imported energy. Oceania now is a battle for influence with Australia, New Zealand, the US, Taiwan. So Taiwan President Lai Ching-te was touring South Pacific.
That's true, but obviously, if one looks at it from the perspective of China's involvement in the world, and region by region, then it is still vanishingly small. But if one looks at it from Africa's perspective, it's a game changer, right? Kind of not only China specifically, but what kind of connections that it opened to the Indian Ocean rim. Because it's not only China, it's also all of these Gulf countries and India, Turkey, all of these other kind of actors who, in some ways, I mean, they're all independent actors, but China's success in Africa set a template that these countries could respond to and did respond to. Whereas Europe and the US did not respond to that in the same way. They responded to it more in the way that we've been picking apart, which is rhetorically, performatively, kind of et cetera, narratively, not in terms of, say, the way that the UAE has been jumping into kind of like different kinds of energy investments, sustainable or not, in different African countries. We just haven't seen the level of actual engagement from that kind of Atlantic side as we're seeing on the Indian Ocean side. And China is a big player there. It certainly isn't the only one, but I think it was it had a kind of a triggering effect, I think, or like a galvanizing effect in that sense.
So you talked about some other news that happened, and this week quite a bit of big news happened over the past 7 days. I don't know if it was timed in conjunction with the visit to try and upstage the visit, but China removed tariff barriers on 33 African countries, the lesser developing countries, LDCs. Now, a lot of people have been talking about this, that the tariff barriers are gone, especially it comes in contrast to what the U.S. is talking about doing next year when Trump is in power by raising lots of tariffs. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to see a surge of imports from China, from Africa into China, in part because there are still quite a few non-tariff barriers. A lot of these countries will have to meet very high photosanitary requirements, hygiene requirements for their agriculture to be sold into the Chinese market. That is a very expensive process, a very complex process, but at least it's a start. We also saw a big announcement last week in South Africa between Huawei and MTN that Huawei signed a big cloud deal with MTN. So that was very big news. And then Temu, the huge online e-commerce, launched in Nigeria. So as you pointed out, in our daily coverage, there's just a lot more activity at every level of society in terms of not just at the military or security or the government or the policy level, but also in the corporate space, the infrastructure development space. There's also places like Changsha in Hunan province, which is a laboratory for China-Africa engagement, which we don't have anything comparable in the United States. There's not a major hub in the United States that is innovating a lot in terms of business engagement, commodity exchanges, and things like that, specifically focused on Africa. Certainly in Europe, you don't see that either in terms of this excitement about dealing with it, the way you see in places like Changsha and to some extent even in Zhejiang as well. So I think that's an interesting point. Let's close our discussion, Cobus. In Africa, in Kenya, we mentioned earlier that there was not a lot of coverage, but there were a few opinion pieces. And I want to share one that was published in the Standard newspaper. That's one of Kenya's major daily newspapers and largest online news sites, written by Onyago Konyago, who is a Kenyan journalist and a communications consultant. Again, this is from a newspaper. I took the copy, fed it into a text-to-audio generator, so it's a little bit more entertaining. And they even have these cool accents now. So the machines are getting smarter, Cobus. Be afraid. Be very afraid. So let's listen to what Konyago had to say about the China aspects of the Biden visits.
Beijing's influence has been rising, with its investments in Africa surpassing those of the US. While Washington under President Joe Biden's administration has done little in terms of development, and even with his visit to Angola this week, just a month before leaving office in January 2025, China has continued to execute massive infrastructural projects in a continent historically sidelined by its former colonizers. Biden's visit to Africa is aimed at reassuring the continent that Washington understands its development agenda and is ready to help. This marks a shift from the long-standing view that Africa primarily needs foreign aid and donations rather than tangible development. These changes are occurring in large part due to China's sustained commitment to supporting Africa without internal interference.
By the way, that AI was supposed to be a Kenyan accent, but it had a hint of French in there. So I'm not sure if the machines have really gotten the accents down. But nonetheless, you got a sense of what Konyago was saying there. A couple key words kind of jump out there. One, internal affairs. That was very interesting at the end there. That's a Chinese talking point to say internal affairs. And number two, that reference to former colonizers is very interesting as well. And you see how that history is still very close to the surface for many people on the continent, and something that, of course, is very close to the surface among Chinese as well. I don't know if Konyago is what his background is. I haven't heard of him before. You always have to be a little bit cautious in a lot of African media publications where there are quite a few people who take a very pro-China stance on things because they've done some of the junkets. They've become very, very much aligned with China's thinking about Africa because they have engaged in seminars and whatnot. Not sure if that's the case here, but nonetheless, I thought it was an interesting point, and it was really one of the main opinion columns in the Standard on the issue of the Biden visit, so it got some prominence.
Yeah, it's very interesting. There seems to be an implication or implied reference to the dispute between the Biden administration and Uganda around anti-LGBT legislation. That may be one of the things that's implied there in that line on China not getting involved in internal affairs in Africa, which is, of course, now with the change in power in DC, Uganda is suddenly flavor of the month. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out over the kind of Democratic Republican fault line. It is interesting, just this line, I think, from a lot of African observers, which frequently touch on these two things. Like, one is infrastructure, and then the other one is we are left alone when we want to be left alone by China. In a sense, it is this kind of expression of African agency in relation to China, is that, kind of like we can engage with them on stuff we want to engage with, and then we don't have to engage with them on stuff we don't want to engage with. Whereas with the West, we are forced to engage with stuff with them that we don't want to engage with, which is an interesting. It's interesting to read that at this particular moment, when the language of sovereignty has mutated into something that I think a lot of people wouldn't have recognized looking from earlier decades. But also that, there is such an interesting thing in US politics at the moment. And even though the discourse on the Republican side is so anti-China, it ends up kind of weirdly connecting to pro-China discourses in other parts of the world on the back end. So for example, in a shared opposition, shared by, some Africans, some Chinese state actors and the Republican Party on, kind of refusing to support LGBT rights in other countries, for example, right? So in that sense, it's this, ironies abound, kind of like in terms of this. I think in some ways I can't but see it as a larger kind of like symptom, I think, of global liberalism in crisis. Right, kind of, which I think is kind of the bigger story of our moment. It's the kind of shredding of shared ideas of rights and, and the shredding of shared language that the world inherited from Western liberalism after the Second World War, and then the question of what we have after that, like what the world looks like after that.
It's interesting because the way that you framed it now sounds like there may be actually some alignment between the pragmatism that the Chinese have shown in their engagement in Africa, where they really just want to get from A to B in terms of doing deals, in terms of opening markets, in terms of expanding opportunities for their state-owned enterprises and whatnot, and not getting bogged down in some of the cultural and human rights and environmental issues. And when you look at some of the leading Africa thinkers in the conservative circles, and I'm thinking of Joshua Meservey here, who is a longtime Africa scholar formerly at the Heritage Foundation, now at the Hudson Institute, and we're actually I'm going to reach out to him. We're trying to get him to come on the show. So Joshua, if you're listening, expect an email from me because I'd like to hear an articulation of this because I think it's very important that we all better understand how conservatives and how MAGA and how the Republicans see the world because that's the world we live in today. And he wrote on X the day after the election, he said, I think U.S.-Africa relations will improve as a Trump administration takes a pragmatic approach and there won't be dramatic changes towards many African countries. But here's the downside for you, Cobus. But he said, off the top of my head, some potential winners, Somaliland, Uganda, Morocco, and Egypt, and then some losers, Somalia and South Africa. So there you go. But I think that focus that he had on pragmatism may be very interesting. They're going to pursue deals, is what they said. Now, again, that's been difficult for Americans in Africa because American companies for the past 20 years have said, we're not interested in deals in Africa. We're not interested in anything in Africa. You have the Corporate Council and any number of lobby groups that are desperately trying to get American companies to go over to Africa. And yet, what do we see? We see the tech companies like Google and we see X and others closing and reducing their footprints in Africa, at least in terms of manpower. Data centers is a different story. So it's a tough sell, very, very tough sell for Americans. And I'm not sure if pragmatism is going to really change that. But again, it may be interesting to watch how the U.S. approach and the Chinese approach converge in the coming administration.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be very interesting. And I think a convergence, will always need to carry several asterisks, because it will be on certain levels. If it happens, it will be on certain levels and certainly not on others. But yeah, I think that is definitely worth watching. I think the default assumption that Trump is just simply anti-China and that he will be, quote, anti-China, whatever that means in an African context, I think needs a lot of unpacking.
I don't think that's true, by the way, either. He's a big admirer of Xi Jinping. I think he wants a deal with China. He keeps talking about how he wants to bend China to his will. That's the issue for Trump. I don't think he cares whether it's good or bad. That's my take on it.
Yes. I mean, I had to, with all due respect to Joshua, to laugh a little bit at the idea of Somaliland being a winner when, when the first thing I thought when I saw that was...
Somaliland, I think, is going to be a winner.
Yeah, it'll be a winner in the short term. In the medium term, it'll be the next South Sudan.
Fair enough. But I think they're going to get recognized by the U.S. government.
So whatever winning means, it'll be a winner for the next 4 years, but then...
But remember, Somaliland is tied to Taiwan because Taiwan has a representative office in Somaliland. There's a lot of good vibes about Somaliland in Washington, thanks to people like Joshua and Tibor Naj and others and Peter Pham who've gone over there and really speak up regularly about Somaliland in D.C. And my guess is that they're going, I'm not an expert in Somaliland politics, but given the mood right now in Washington, one would think that the Republicans are really going to be excited about recognizing Somaliland and they don't like Somalia. And it has an opportunity as a twofer because they get the win on slapping Somalia and they get the win for slapping China because it pisses them off because of the Taiwan issue there. So that feels like a no-brainer to me.
I don't know. I might want to put a little bit of brain in there because I don't know that Taiwan can necessarily count on Republican support either. I mean, Trump has been very mercantilist about that issue in the past. Yeah, so we'll have to see. That's the thing with Trump is one always has to see. It's always such a waxing and waning. There's no surety, right? Kind of the landscape keeps shifting, depending on what's happening. So, short-term deals, sure. Long-term stability or support, maybe not. But yeah, the thing about South Africa being targeted, I can see that. I mean, in the end, I think the official reason will be Russia-related. Probably the actual reason is probably Gaza-related. But I think the longer-term effect is just going to be pushing South Africa closer to China. And the thing with South Africa is you may not like South Africa, but it is still, and it has always controlled the only other major shipping route if you're unable to ship through the Red Sea. And that always changes the game, particularly because, shipping through the Red Sea is already so fraught, even before the Trump administration's come in.
And my guess is that probably also has security implications as well for the U.S. Navy for rights of passage as well. So, but please don't scare off Joshua Meservey, okay? We want to get him on the show. We want to have, I'm really committed to trying to better understand and to do more to platform what's going on in Washington and the thinking in Washington, because I think it's important we all have a better understanding. And people like Joshua are very insightful on this. So Cobus, please don't scare him away, because we need to have these folks on. You know, we don't get Chinese scholars anymore. We can't kind of now eliminate the Americans too, Cobus. So that's where we are today. We've gone a little bit longer than I had hoped, but lots to cover today, lots to discuss. It kind of went in a slightly more Joe Rogan type of approach and just freeballing it and seeing where it takes us. But I think that's going to be the way it is with the Trump administration, where we just don't have a lot of certainties. And I think that's going to be the mantra you hear over and over again, where it's kind of like, maybe it's that, but maybe not. And I think we all have to be on our toes as to what's going to happen. And especially in the run-up to the inauguration, it's already been quite a dynamic process. So a lot to follow. And we're going to be following it very closely at the China Global South Project in order to better understand the dynamic of how the great power competition is going to play out in places like Africa, the Middle East, South America, and here, of course, in Southeast Asia as well. Listen, we're going to update our intro and our outros pretty soon, because X, not as important to us anymore. The China watching community has all gone over to Blue Sky, and it's fantastic over at Blue Sky. You can just look us up at China Global South Project on Blue Sky. Right now, we're at chinagsproject.bsky.social. We've got it in our links in the show notes, but we'd love for you to join our community over there that's starting to really grow, and the atmosphere is very different. And so if you're interested in China and China watching and all the different aspects of it, I highly recommend that you head over to Blue Sky to check that out. And of course, if you want to follow the great work that Cobus is doing every day and the team at the China Global South Project in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, go over to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. We can't tell you how much we appreciate the subscriptions, as it supports our work and also our Patreon supporters. And if you are a teacher or a student, we have a special offer for you. You get half off. Just email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you the links to the half off discount code. So that would be great for you to join our reader community. So we'll be back next week with another edition of the show. We're winding up the year, and we're getting to our year in review and year in preview show that we're going to do right before we take off for a 2-week break over the Christmas holiday, because, you know, frankly, a lot of people just want to tune it all out for Christmas and New Year's. And we know that, and we too want to tune it out. So we'll take a break from the 20th until about the 3rd, but we do want to leave you with an extra special episode from us about our year in review and year in preview show. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus Van Staden in Cape Town, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.